Bruce Bechdel is an oddity in a book filled with outsiders. Alison Bechdel illustrates her childhood in the graphic narrative Fun Home as a labyrinth of episodes and anecdotes, many told multiple times, but always with new information. This creates the story the same way that it was unraveled to her. As new details surface, the memories become clearer. Her father, Bruce, distanced himself from their family and from groups of other outsiders. He was an outwardly heterosexual, married high school English teacher working in a funeral home that was also a deep-in-the-closet gay. Alison, a lesbian woman, struggles with the possibility that he was a manic depressive and killed himself. It is not Bruce's sexual identity, but rather his desperate need to try and express himself without ever accepting that identity that renders him incapable of fitting into any society. Fun Home offers a cry for those who are alienated from social norms and then become defined by exclusion, making themselves into aliens within communities of outsiders. The character of Bruce is often expressed through literary allusions. Alison uses this not only because it explains the ways in which he constructed himself, but also because it is the side effect of maintaining separation between her and her father. He uses these impersonations, illusions, really to disconnect himself from the real world. He builds his life on the bones of the literary classics that he loves, so Alison has little else to fall back on when recreating his character. He is, simply, the best and worst parts of some of the most well-known icons in the literary tradition. When he does not live up to the lofty expectations of this network of illusions, it is deeply troubling and he cannot accept himself. This is not just a clever and intelligent way of reminiscing about what her father was like. It is the way he tried to portray himself, and it is how she grew to know her father. It is not an attempt at metaphor for the delight and understanding of the reader. To know Bruce at all is to see him as a fictional character, and not as a man. The first extended comparison is one that Alison draws to explain her father's obsessive neatness and need for decorative embellishment. His cleanliness, a stereotype of his closeted sexual identity, clashes with his love of decoration, and he does not make cleaning easy. Much to the family's distress, he would come home with new pieces of garbage and had the ability to mend, shine, or reinvent them until their entire house was a pastiche of Victorian knickknacks that would overwhelm even those that lived there. Just as Daedalus, the master craftsman of Greek mythology, makes a labyrinth to keep the Minotaur in prison, so too does Bruce create a labyrinth of his house. Daedalus was fixated on his inventions, even at the expense of others. His son, Icarus, became a victim of his father's passion, killed while flying too close to the sun with the wings Daedalus had made. Bruce utilizes his children as free labor, focusing only on his vision for what Alison describes as a museum and never really a home. He views the house as his creation that requires never-ending perfection. His passion for historical restoration is a burden to his children, and he does not take into account the physical and mental anguish that they go through. Even Alison becomes a thing that he can shape and decorate. Her clothes reflect his fashion choices, his attempt to show her off as something that she is not. Unfortunately, the artificer's vision does not always come to be fully realized. When something gets in the way of Bruce's curatorial conception, Alison says, "It was impossible to tell if the Minotaur lay beyond the next corner." One of his many antisocial tendencies was his fits of rage. One series of panels depicts the family decorating for Christmas when the children are little. Alison's brother holds up the tree so that Bruce can adjust it and get it just right. When the boy, who is half the size of the evergreen, loses his grip, his father becomes infuriated. Bruce is the great creator in Daedalus and the destroyer in the Minotaur, a monster only made possible through the invention of Daedalus. Bruce builds his labyrinth of a house that traps him inside and cuts him off from the outside world. Transforming shining artifacts of trash are a part of the deep self-deceit that distances him from his family. Alison says, He used his skillful artifice not to make things, but to make things appear to be what they were not. It is his job as the artificer to artifice, the job of the craftsman to deceive. One of his actual occupations rewards him for this. He grew up in the family business, a funeral home, and took it over early in his life as a husband. The job of embalmer is one that is generally regarded as strange. It requires the living to interact often with the dead, something that is only discussed in hushed tones and in private places. A profession that cuts off contact with living beings, leaving the only opportunities for companionship with those who have lost that freedom. Bruce's duties go beyond embalming, though. He is responsible for making up the faces and bodies of the dead. He has to make them look like they are only asleep. It is another exercise in changing the state of something, if only by appearance. Death is a state that he fights against, only to succumb to it in what Alison believes is suicide. In a letter to Alison while she is in college, he describes the process of doing up an old woman for her funeral. I did my best with red lips, green eyeshadow, lots of rogue and eyebrow pencil, and lo and behold, there lay Faye. She had lovely, flawlessly smooth skin. Everyone was pleased, and you would have never guessed she was 70. His job here is to make something fit in that cannot even be talked about in public. He is proud that he makes the 70-year-old woman look younger. He makes dead people something that they can no longer be. In this way, Bruce also fights against his sexual identity. Queerness and death are both socially seen as states of being. Queer identity is also murmured in private because of the discomfort that the speaker feels, as if you can catch the condition. The same idea applies to the fear of talking about death too much, that it is bound to haunt you. Bruce does not embrace the fruits of open gay and lesbian pride and expression as Alison does when she goes to college. Therefore, in order to try and be the character that he creates for himself, he becomes more distant, by making up his whole life in the same way he makes up his house and makes up the dead. His job as artificer of his own life means that he must make himself appear as what he is not. This plays out during Alison's childhood when romantic life between her parents is basically non-existent. She describes her family life as an Arctic climate. Her mother and father both seemingly embarrassed of the marriage. Only twice did she ever behold any gestures of affection between the two. Most of the discussion in Fun Home focuses on the fact that Bruce is gay, but it has a hard time explaining his marriage. His self-deceit is furthered intentionally by constructing his romantic life with the help, again, of literary illusion. Before they were married, Bruce and Helen exchanged letters. She sends him a copy of F. Scott Fitzgerald's biography, by which he is captivated. Just as Fitzgerald had done with Zelda, Bruce began courting Helen while in the army. He becomes Fitzgerald, even mimicking how he shows his love. His letters, which slowly creep into what Alison calls Fitzgerald-esque sentiment, identify himself with Fitzgerald's characters, namely Jay Gatsby. The partying that Gatsby and Fitzgerald took part in fascinated him. Bruce's amazing impressionability, seen throughout the graphic narrative, is why he can be so obviously paralleled to Gatsby. Stereotype is a theme that continues to surface in Fun Home. The most obvious is the stereotypical manly man that goes after women. The problem with Bruce is that his interpretations of himself in literature are often wrong, or at least misled. His marriage was created on the belief that he is Fitzgerald, but he is not. It is just another facade because he does not realize that he's Zelda. He desperately wants to be on the receiving end of the letters that he was writing because he loves Fitzgerald's words. His admiration of Fitzgerald goes past wanting to be him. He wants to be with him. Maybe or maybe not romantically, but it means that Bruce pushes himself out of his own marriage by creating it on false claims. He did not understand the terms of the illusions that he led his life by, and he realizes that somewhere in his life, but his choices had already been made. A stereotype is fictionalization. It is a blanket claim used to oversimplify and misrepresent someone or something. Bruce's trouble does not stop with him not fitting into the heteronormative life that he publicly leads, but continues while he struggles to find a place for himself in the gay community. In the small town where they live, not only is it socially impossible to be openly gay, but being closeted has allowed him to lead a kind of lifestyle that would have alienated him from the queer community. Multiple times in the novel, Alison provides instances where he may possibly be having sexual affairs with his male teenage students. But of course, Alison does not talk about this directly. The first time she ever connects with her father is through literature. He is her 12th grade English teacher, and he can finally share the things that mean the most to him. His library is extensive. In fact, when he would mingle with his male students, he would always share a book with them. Not only is Alison engaged, but Bruce seems more involved in his daughter's life than he ever had. She says that he began to sense my potential as an intellectual companion. She illustrates this section of their class when they read The Catcher in the Rye. He discusses Mr. Antolini, Holden Caulfield's old English teacher. He asks them about the events that occur when Holden stays a night at Mr. Antolini's. He scolds them when no one, other than Alison, can tell him that Mr. Antolini makes a pass at Holden. He screams this in front of a classroom of students, and Alison tells us that one of the male students is currently helping her father move things from their basement. She describes her father as having an awesome capacity for cognitive dissonance, simultaneously holding two contradictory ideas. The comparisons that can be made between Holden and Bruce, while tempting, seem to just scratch the surface. He does find himself in a way, and he is just as hypocritical as the anti-hero, but Bruce cannot see that he actually is Mr. Antolini. All her life, Alison sees her father with one young man after another, while continuing to stay married to Helen. When Alison is a teenager, her father is put on trial because he bought a beer for an underage male. In court, the charges are dropped if he agrees to go to counseling. Ironically, Helen has suspicions that Bruce is having an affair with his male psychiatrist. Oscar Wilde plays a huge part for Alison here. She even says that the actual accusation of the case was one that dared not speak its name. Alison's feelings turn out to be grounded. 4 months before Bruce's death, he comes out to her. Her mother, infuriated, tells her that there had been many other boys, including a childhood babysitter that had even gone on family vacations with them. The stereotype of the predator and pedophile of the older gay man is one that is unfortunate, but also one that excludes Bruce from the gay community. This exclusion did not come from others. He allows it to define him, and when he attempts to reach out to others who share the same sexual identity as him, it is awkward and unpleasant. When the children visit New York City with him, they casually walk by the Stonewall Inn, where only a few weeks before riots had sparked the modern gay rights movement. When Bruce finally tells Alison about his sexual identity, he explains to her his first experience, as he calls it. It is not the warm reunion that she hoped for. It is awkward for the both of them because she had become a champion for lesbianism, a scholar on the subject that had explored who she really was, but he barely knew anything about himself. They have their Ithaca moment, but Telemachus and Odysseus do not embrace to defeat the suitors here. Alison explains that it is incorrect to define a homosexual as a person whose gender expression is at odds with his or her sex, but for her and her father, it seems to be precise. What pushes Bruce outside of any community is not his amazing hypocrisy, but society's inability to imagine humans complexly. He pushes gender roles onto Alison, but has no intention of clinging to them himself. He attempts to make her pretty when she is a child, dressing her as he would like, forcing her to wear a beret that is so passionately mentioned it becomes a symbol for gender norms, discouraging her from being like the truck-driving bulldyke whose image intrigues and stays with Alison. He does admit to Alison that he wished he was a girl while he was growing up. After his death, she finds a picture of him as a young man posing in a woman's bathing suit. The argument is not that his gender expression has anything to do with his sexual identity, but if he had not created himself in contrast to who he is, he would have had the opportunity to really find out. Fun Home is not a condemnation of Bruce Bechdel, but it does not exist to make excuses for him either. Alison Bechdel dares to discuss the effects and repercussions of creating oneself based on the actions of others, and the meaning of inclusion across different groups and generations of people. Fun Home is a plea for the understanding of outsiders and aliens from our communities, our stereotypes, and our worldviews.